The text came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. Before my alarm, before coffee, before the world had any right to fall apart. I was still half asleep when my phone lit up on the nightstand. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. But something made me pick it up. This is Dale Hutchins. I did the electrical work on your office building on Mercer Street about 8 months ago. I know this is out of nowhere and I apologize for that. But I think you need to call me back before you go into work today. Please? It's about your wife. I sat up in bed and read it 3 times. My wife was asleep next to me, her hair spread across the pillow, one arm tucked under her cheek. She looked peaceful. She always looked peaceful. That used to make me feel lucky. Reading that text, I wasn't so sure anymore. I slipped out of bed, pulled on a shirt, and walked to the back porch. The neighborhood was still gray and quiet. I called the number. Dale picked up on the first ring like he'd been waiting with his phone in his hand. He apologized again before he said anything else. Told me he wasn't the kind of man who got involved in other people's business. Said he'd gone back and forth about this for 2 weeks before finally sending the message. I appreciated that. Told him so. Then I asked him what he knew. He explained slowly. When he'd done the electrical work on our office, he'd also installed a network-connected security camera system at my request, 2 cameras in the main space, one pointing at the front door, one covering the conference area and filing cabinets. Standard stuff. He'd set it up through a cloud service and handed me the login credentials when the job was done. What he hadn't mentioned, what he'd only realized recently, was that he'd accidentally linked the feed to his own monitoring account as a backup during setup and then forgotten to remove it. He'd discovered it 2 weeks ago when he was cleaning up old project files on his laptop and noticed an active feed he didn't recognize. He watched just enough to understand what was happening. Then he stopped, saved a copy of what he'd seen, and spent 2 weeks deciding whether to call me. I asked him what was on the footage. He was quiet for a long moment. Your wife, he said. Your brother-in-law. And another woman? They've been meeting in your office on the days you work from home. I counted 5 separate visits in the past 3 weeks alone. My brother-in-law. My wife's older brother, Kevin. The man I'd lent $40,000 to 18 months ago when his contracting business was hemorrhaging cash. The man who came to our house every Sunday for dinner and clapped me on the shoulder and called me his favorite person in the family. I stood on my back porch in the early morning cold and let that settle in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I asked who the woman was. I don't know her name, Dale said. But she brings documents. A lot of them. And your wife signs things? Every visit. I told him I needed to see the footage. He said he'd already expected that and sent me a secure link before we hung up. I watched it standing at my kitchen counter while the coffee maker hissed and sputtered behind me. The timestamp on the first clip was 11 days ago, a Thursday. I'd been home that day, working from the spare bedroom. My wife had told me she was running errands and then meeting a friend for lunch. She was home by 3. Made pasta for dinner. Asked me how my day went. On the footage, she walked into our office on Mercer Street at 11:14 that same morning. Kevin came in right behind her. The woman I didn't recognize, late 40s, sharp posture, professional blazer, came in carrying a leather document portfolio. They sat at the conference table. The woman laid out papers. My wife flipped through them, nodding. Kevin pointed at specific lines and my wife wrote on them. Signed them. Then they put everything back in the portfolio and the woman left. My wife and Kevin talked for a few more minutes. Kevin hugged her. She was smiling when she left. I stood in my kitchen and watched all 5 clips. Then I watched the first one again. By the time my wife came downstairs, I was rinsed, dressed, and holding a cup of coffee by the window. She kissed me on the cheek and asked if I'd slept okay. I told her I had. She poured herself a cup and started talking about something her mother had said on the phone the previous night. I listened and nodded and said the right things at the right moments. Inside, I was already building the list. My wife and I had been married for 4 years. We'd built the business together, a small commercial real estate investment firm. Nothing flashy but solid. We had 3 properties under our LLC, a healthy line of operating credit, and 2 investment accounts that we'd grown from almost nothing in the first 2 years. The firm was in both our names. Everything was joint. That had been intentional. A gesture of trust. I'd insisted on it when we formed the entity. She'd cried when I suggested it. Said it was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for her. I thought about that on the drive to the office and tried to understand how those 2 things could exist in the same person. I didn't go inside when I arrived. I sat in the parking lot and called my college roommate, a man named Patrick who had gone on to become a business litigation attorney in Atlanta. We hadn't spoken in about 6 weeks. He picked up sounding surprised and happy. I told him I needed his help with something serious and I needed it to be completely confidential and I needed it to start today. He went quiet and professional in the span of about 3 seconds. That's one of the things I've always respected about Patrick. He doesn't treat a serious thing like a casual one. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me 2 questions. Did I still have access to the original camera logging credentials from when Dale set them up? Yes. Had I signed or been presented with any new business documents in the past 3 months? I thought about it. No. Good, he said. Sit tight. Don't let on that you know anything. I'm going to make some calls and I'll have a clearer picture for you by end of day. I went inside and worked. I replied to emails. I took a call from a property manager about a minor roof repair. I ate lunch at my desk. My wife texted at noon asking if I wanted her to pick up anything on her way home. I told her I was craving Thai food. She sent back a heart emoji. Patrick called me back at 4:15. He had spoken to a colleague who specialized in business fraud and asset protection. Based on what I described in the footage, the pattern was consistent with something called a fraudulent transfer scheme. The woman in the footage was almost certainly a notary or a transaction facilitator of some kind. What they appeared to be doing, and this was Patrick's educated read, not yet confirmed, was preparing transfer documents to move ownership of our LLC's assets into a separate entity, one that my wife and Kevin were either already controlling or planning to control. Once the transfer was complete and legally processed, they would effectively own our properties and accounts while my name remained attached to the liabilities. The operating credit, the maintenance obligations, the loans, they were going to hollow me out and leave me holding the shell. I sat in my parked car in front of our office and stared at the building my wife and I had painted together the first spring we owned it. She'd gotten pale yellow on her forearm and laughed about it for 3 days. We need to move fast, Patrick said. But we need to move right. If you tip your hand too early, they'll accelerate the timeline or destroy evidence. Can you act completely normal for the next 5 to 7 days? I thought about the pasta she'd made me on that Thursday. How she'd asked how my day went. I told Patrick I could manage that. Over the next 4 days, I became a different kind of husband. Not colder, not distant that would have been noticed. I became warmer, actually. More attentive. I brought home flowers on Wednesday for no reason. I suggested we invite Kevin over for dinner on Thursday, my idea, which surprised her just enough that she blinked before she said that sounded great. Kevin came over and grilled with me on the back patio and told me about a new commercial project he was bidding on. I asked questions. I refilled his beer. I smiled at every joke. Under the surface, I was a frozen lake. Patrick had connected me with his fraud specialist colleague, a woman named Renata Cho who worked out of a quiet suite in a building downtown with no name on the door. She had 15 years of experience in exactly this kind of case. In our first meeting, she reviewed all 5 video clips, the original LLC formation documents, and the property records. She was fast and clinical and didn't waste words. By the end of the hour, she had a plan. Step 1 was placing a protective hold on all 3 of our investment properties through an emergency legal filing. The properties would be frozen from any transfer or sale pending investigation. Step 2 was pulling the operating credit lines back under documentation that required dual in-person verification for any major transaction, which would require me to be physically present, making any behind-the-scenes move impossible. Step 3 was the most important one. We needed to know exactly what those documents were that my wife had been signing. Dale was the key to that. I called him back and thanked him properly. Told him what his footage had meant and what I was doing with it. He got quiet in the way that people get when they realize they made the right call. He asked if there was anything else he could do. I told him there was one thing. The camera system he'd installed had a higher resolution archive mode that could be activated remotely if you still had admin credentials. He did. I asked if he'd be willing to activate it so that going forward, any meeting in that office would be captured in full detail including audio. He said he'd have it running within the hour. He also said something I didn't expect. He said he was sorry it had come to this. That he'd met my wife twice during the installation job and she'd seemed like a good person. That he genuinely wished he'd been wrong about what he'd seen. I told him I was sorry too. The audio from the following Tuesday changed everything. My wife told Kevin the timeline had moved up. She'd gotten nervous about something she didn't say what and wanted to accelerate the final filing from the end of the month to that Friday. Kevin sounded irritated. Said it was too fast, that their facilitator needed more lead time. My wife told him to make it work. Then she said something that I've replayed in my head more times than I can count. He trusts me completely. That's the problem with men like him. They think love is a reason to stop paying attention. Kevin laughed. I don't know what I felt in that moment. It wasn't anger exactly. Anger is hot and loud. This was something else, quiet and total, like a door closing. I forwarded the audio to Renata and Patrick within the hour. Renata called me back 20 minutes later. Her voice had a different quality to it than usual. Still professional but sharper. She told me the audio, combined with the video footage, was more than sufficient. She said we were ready to move and we needed to do it before Friday. I asked her to schedule everything for Thursday morning. I spent Wednesday evening the same way I'd spent every evening that week, present, normal, unremarkable. My wife made dinner. We watched a show we'd been following. I told her she looked nice. She leaned against me on the couch and at some point fell asleep. I turned off the television and covered her with the throw blanket and sat in the dark for a while. I thought about the version of my life that was supposed to happen. The one I'd been living inside of while she was planning this other one. I didn't sleep much. But when Thursday came, I was calm in a way I hadn't expected. Not numb, calm. Like a man who has done the preparation and is now simply executing. My wife left for what she told me was a yoga class at 8:30 in the morning. I watched her car pull out of the driveway from the kitchen window. Then I sent one text to Patrick, "We're good, start." I showered, dressed, and drove downtown to meet Renata. Patrick joined by video call from Atlanta. By 9:45 a.m., the emergency asset freeze had been formally filed. The LLC's 3 properties were locked. The operating accounts had been flagged with dual authorization holds. And Renata had personally contacted the state's business registry to put a hold on any pending transfer filings involving our LLC pending fraud investigation. Whatever my wife and Kevin had been planning to file on Friday no longer had anywhere to land. At 11 a.m., I drove to the office on Mercer Street. My wife arrived 12 minutes after I did. She walked in through the front door with a folder under her arm and stopped when she saw me sitting at the conference table with a cup of coffee in front of me and nothing else. She recovered quickly. She was good at that. "Hey, I didn't know you were coming in today. I was just picking up some paperwork." I looked at the folder under her arm. "What paperwork?" She set it on the table and pulled out a chair. "Just some vendor contracts. Nothing exciting." She smiled. "You look serious. Everything okay?" I nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about the business," I said. "About where we're headed. Our long-term plans." She said that sounded like a good conversation to have and reached for her phone, a small reflex, barely noticeable. Checking something. I noted it. I told her I'd been looking at our LLC filings recently. That I'd noticed some activity I wanted to ask her about. I watched her expression go through 3 or 4 tiny adjustments in about 2 seconds. She landed on relaxed concern, like a spouse who's been raised a reasonable question, not a woman whose plan is currently unraveling. She said she didn't know what I was referring to and asked me to be more specific. I placed my phone on the table between us, screen up, and pressed play on the audio from Tuesday. Her own voice filled the room. "He trusts me completely. That's the problem with men like him. They think love is a reason to stop paying attention." She went still. I let it play another 30 seconds, Kevin's laugh. Her instructions about accelerating the timeline, the mention of Friday, and then I stopped it. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The office was completely quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. "How long?" I asked. She started to say something. Stopped. Tried again. Her voice came out different than I'd ever heard it. Smaller and off balance. She said it wasn't what it sounded like. That I didn't understand the full context. That Kevin had been advising her on restructuring for the good of the business and she hadn't handled the communication well, but there was no bad intent. I let her finish. Then I told her about the cameras. All 5 video clips. I told her about Dale and how he'd reached out, and that his doing so was the luckiest thing that had happened to me in years. I told her that every document she'd signed over the past 3 weeks had been captured, that the woman with the portfolio had already been identified by Renata's office as a notary who specialized in private business transfers, and that the specific documents which Renata had subpoenaed from the notary's filing records that morning showed a clear attempt to transfer our LLC's primary property assets to a new single-member entity, incorporated in Kevin's name 2 months ago. I watched her process that. The part about the notary. The part about the subpoena. She put both hands flat on the table. I told her about the asset freeze. About the holds on the accounts. About the fraud investigation flag at the state business registry. I told her that Patrick, whom she'd met at our wedding, whom she'd called the funniest man she'd ever met at our reception, had been working on this since Tuesday of the previous week. She said my name. Just my name. Once. I stood up. I told her that what happened next was going to be determined by how she and Kevin responded to the legal process. That Renata had already sent formal correspondence to Kevin's business address that morning. That the documentation of fraud was strong enough that a criminal referral was not off the table. That the best possible outcome for everyone involved, herself included, was full cooperation and a clean dissolution of the marriage without any further attempts to move assets or destroy evidence. She asked me if I had a lawyer present. I told her I had two. She looked at the folder she'd brought in. The one she'd said was vendor contracts. Then she looked at me. And for the first time in what I now understood was a very long time, she looked at me honestly. "I thought you wouldn't notice," she said. "You were always so focused on the day-to-day. You never looked at the big picture stuff." I picked up my coffee and walked toward the door. "I noticed," I said. The formal separation proceedings began the following week. Kevin hired an attorney and initially tried to claim the transfer documents were a legitimate business restructuring that I'd verbally consented to. Renata spent about 4 hours dismantling that position using the audio recordings and the video footage and the timeline of events. His attorney withdrew the counterclaim before the end of the second week. The fraud investigation by the state's business division moved more slowly, as those things do. But it moved. Kevin's contractor license came under review pending the investigation. Turns out there had been other irregularities in his business filings that the investigation surfaced as a byproduct. Not my doing. Just what happens when someone starts looking carefully at a person who has been playing fast and loose for a while. My wife's sister called me in the third week and said our family, meaning her family, was heartbroken and that she wanted me to know that not all of them had known what was happening. I told her I believed her. I did believe her. I held no weight for the people who hadn't been in that room. I also called Dale. I took him to dinner at a steakhouse on the east side of town, the good kind with dark wood and quiet booths. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his late 50s with calloused hands and a straightforward way of talking that I liked immediately. He said he felt awkward being thanked so much for something that had made my life harder. I told him the hard part was already in motion before his text arrived. He'd just given me the visibility to respond to it instead of being buried by it. He said he'd been on the fence for 2 weeks and what had finally tipped him was something his father used to say, that the worst thing you can do to a man is let him be deceived when you had the chance to tell him the truth. I thought about that a lot afterward. The divorce was finalized in just under 4 months. The LLC was dissolved by mutual order during the proceedings, the assets liquidated and divided according to Renata's documentation of original contributions and subsequent fraud damages. I came out of it with more than I would have if I'd simply signed whatever they'd prepared for Friday, which had been exactly the point. The night the settlement was finalized, I sat on my back porch with a glass of bourbon and looked at the yard I'd mowed that weekend and the fence I'd fixed 2 springs ago and the fire pit we'd built together out of stacked stone in the first summer we'd lived here. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was more like the particular kind of quiet that comes after a long storm. The damage is real. The tree is down, but the air is clean and you're still standing. A few weeks later, I started looking at commercial properties again. Different city, different scale. Starting over is strange when you're in your early 30s. It feels too young to be starting over and too old to be starting out. But I've come to think that framing is wrong. You don't start over. You start from what you built, from what you lost, from what you learned about which people in your life will pick up the phone and tell you the truth when it costs them something. I have Patrick's number in my phone under attorney, brother. I added the second part after all of this. It felt accurate. I have Dale's number too. I call him every few months just to check in. He's a good man. The world has more of them than you'd think. You just have to end up in the right kind of trouble to find out who they are.